Well, I'm not standing between you and lunch anymore, so I can take as much time as I want, right? I want to thank you for the invitation to come to this conference. I particularly want to thank my co-authors. I'm just a dirt forester, but all of these other co-authors are very smart. So if you have easy questions, you can ask me. If you have hard questions, I'll give you their email. Now, forest spatial patterns, particularly in the southwest United States, are driving forces behind many ecological processes. It's important to understand both large-scale and local environments of our forest trees in order to make forests more sustainable. Long-term studies can aggregate short-term trends, and that's very convenient because I've worked in a 100-year-old experimental forest. And a variety of treatments, particularly uneven age, need to be installed in forests to maintain stability and ecosystem services. So one of the things we were looking at was how, if there's an optimal or facilitative composition and structure that promotes resistance and resiliency of forest under certain climate conditions. Now, I work in Ponderosa Pine forests in the southwest. I live right there. And can you see it? Yeah. So I live right there. But Ponderosa Pine goes from Mexico to Canada, and generally in higher elevations. So in single species forests, our precipitation averages between 51 and 64 centimeters. The elevation range runs from 18 to 100 to 2,600 meters, and the climax dominant is at 2,130 to 2,380. Now, this Ponderosa pine forests fit in the southwest U.S. landscape, and Seahart Merriam used the San Francisco Peaks near Flagstaff, Arizona, of which this is not a figure of, to develop his life zone concept. He related forest types to landform, elevation aspect, and climate, temperature, and moisture. Now, basically, this is actually a map from southern Arizona, but it's the same thing in northern Arizona. Ponderosa pine forests are here in this layer. I call it a layer cake. The bottom limit is usually driven by precipitation or soil moisture availability. The top limit is usually cold or growing season. As I mentioned earlier, I work in an experimental forest, Fort Valley Experimental Forest, which has been around since 1908. And we have active studies going back even as far back as 1909. Now I'm going to talk about a segment of the more recent results from this study, 1925, where they've been looking at uneven age management. But you can see we also have studies in what are called improvement selection, old growth areas, dwarf mistletoe treatments, and then conversion. We actually had uneven age forests. We converted them to even age, and then we said, oh darn, and we're trying to convert them back to uneven age again. There we go. So in this study, the one going back to 1925, there are 64 1-hectare blocks that have been measured for uneven age structure. And in 2017, we remeasured 8 of them, stem mapped them all using field map technology, which our Polish colleague mentioned that. We stem mapped everything, I mean everything. Looked at tree allometric structures, DBH, trees per hectare, basal area. And you can see the tree densities range from 200 to 800 trees per hectare, and the basal area from 19 to 38. We did some measurements of spatial patterns, which I won't really get into in this talk. But this is an example where we measured, again, the trees, location, and the crowns of one of our blocks. So the overall goal of the study is to look at tree size and neighborhood influence, and we were looking at maximum likelihood to estimate parameters exploring tree size and influence on 20-year basal growth responses following treatments. Using the model, again, this is the complicated stuff. You can ask my co-authors. And but these are basically some of the results. So what we see here, starting in this upper left-hand corner, is the lowest density forest. And we're working our way up to the highest density forest here. And you can see, if you look at some of these factors, the You can see the change in aggregation as well, going from low density to high density. And we talk about in the Southwest, we call it clumpy groupy. So there's, Ponderosa pine tends to regenerate in openings. It's very high density. And then as time goes by and there's competitive mortality, it tends to thin out over hundreds of years. So we've been trying to imitate some of that in our silvicultural treatments. So in low aggregation conditions, the trees respond more to, there's more of a uniform growing space, or at least there's a certain available growing space. And in highly aggregated conditions, you see smaller trees may be more sensitive to neighborhood effects than larger trees. And again, conversely then, the larger trees in basal area growth are best described as a function of focal tree size. What's really most dramatic is when you see these effects in terms of changing climate. And we've had some pretty interesting drought periods in the last 40, 50 years. Now, let me start with the graph here. The high density stands of those 8 blocks are on the bottom. The low density stands are on the top. And then what you're seeing here on the y-axis is basal area increment. So we're going along starting up 1977, and not surprisingly, you're seeing the higher basal area increment on the low density stands and the lower on the high density stands. Let me back up a minute. When we stem mapped the stand, we didn't core everything. We sub-selected, we randomly selected a tree and then the 3 nearest trees to it. But that's where we got our growth numbers. So, we're going along, and then we had one pretty good drought in 1996. And the first thing you notice is that all the stands, all the densities stopped growing, or at least are dramatically reduced. It didn't go to zero, but dramatically reduced. We had a treatment in 1997, and the idea for the treatment there was we had both a flat Q factor, and then we have very steep Q factors with the idea of we're trying to imitate what's going on in the national forest around us. So I'm in Forest Service research and development, but the Forest Service National Forest System owns the land. And so we were trying to inform them by imitating some of their treatments. So we had the one drought in 1996, and you can see how the stands sort of snap back. So think of it like a rubber band. That gets pulled and it snaps back into shape. And that's basically what was happening after that first drought. And then the thinning, you can see some of the release. You can see the increase in basal area increment from the residual trees going up after the thinning. And then in 2006, we had another even worse drought. And what's really interesting here is that regardless of the densities, that the basal area increment almost was equal. That's how severe the drought was. And then after the drought, it responded back, and again you had the same kind of hierarchy. You see 2 things. You're seeing that the low density stands they responded more quickly than the high density stands, and then they're still sort of increasing. So the higher overall densities impacted growth rates, but aggregation clouded the results, and drought further clouded that. And I'll mention why in a minute. The density and aggregation had an outsized impact on the smaller trees. Is that a problem for the next generation of overstory trees? Because as foresters, we tend to lean towards the big trees. That's what we see first. It's what makes more money, blah, blah, blah. But what this is suggesting is that we're going to have to leave even more growing space for the smaller trees than we're used to. So it's not just parceling it out in some sort of proportion. We have to leave a disproportionate amount of growing space for the smaller trees if we still want them to be there. In high density sites, nearest neighbor crop tree release might not be effective without a heavy thinning. So because what we're finding is that the neighborhood effect is much farther than we think, just going and clearing the area around your crop tree might not be as effective as it would be, say, in an area where there's more moisture. And then severe drought events can reduce growth over all densities, but lower density stands return more quickly to pre-drought growth trends. And so, you've seen the density management diagrams, and basically what drought does, it takes this mortality level and moves it to the left. But, one thing that's a little deceptive is that it's not like the trees are doing fine until they hit the maximum density line. They're slowing down. And so when you're moving it, you're not just increasing the mortality, but you're slowing the growth of the residual trees. And then the other thing is that, I say optimal density is the one that maintains forest health after negative events. I like to say that growth is gradual, but mortality is forever. And so we really have to manage the stands for the bad times and not for the averages. Because I once worked in a forest, and I came to that forest, and the weather and the climate was right there. And I spent the next 3 years trying to deal with 75% mortality in my stands. So you really have to manage the stands for the bad times. And I call it pessimistic forestry. And manage it for the bad times, not for the average. And we're back on track.